Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I am an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. I'm here with my great friend Tren, who has a new title, actually. Hello, Tren.
Hi everybody, this is your friend Chan. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe, late medieval China. I'm based in Austin, Texas as for now, but next month I'm going to move to Houston, Texas. For the past couple of weeks, a lot of things happened in my life. I've successfully defended my PhD dissertation, so it's actually Dr. Gan now, I suppose, and also received a one-year teaching position at Rice University working on medieval global ages, stuff like that. Yeah. So great to be back after all the important events in life to continue our Versucher journey with you, Aran.
And yes, and I'm very happy about all the new updates in your life. So, what we are going to do here is that we're following our Versucher project that has been focused on the concept of human nature for some time. And we're going to enter a new layer of that conversation. Just for those of you who need a refresher or you're joining us for this a specific part of the project, you can definitely follow along our conversation without necessarily watching the past episodes and past conversations. But it is helpful to, at least as a refresher, to mention why we are here and what we are trying to achieve. We did a lot of work on history of philosophy. We did a deep dive into Hegel's logic, and what we saw there, and what we saw not only in Hegel, but actually anyone that Hegel also criticizes, like Kant, maybe even more so than Hegel himself, was a very important assumption. And that assumption, for the lack of better terms, always concerned human nature. There always seemed to be an axiomatic acceptance of certain features of humanity, or a hierarchical position about which layers of humanity are more important than the others. In a lot of the post-Enlightenment thinking, even thinkers after Renaissance in general, there has been an emphasis on reason. And this emphasis on reason is not exactly a repeat of what thinkers like Aristotle or Plato proposed in the ancient Greek traditions of thinking, but it has a similar obsession for the around that centrality of reason, and the concept of reason is also centralized in a way that it seems like there is a core that is untouchable. That although, for instance, Hegel in Reason and History talks about unfolding of reason in history, he seems to think that what is changing is not reason itself or some fundamental feature of humanity, but it is like different expression, different manifestations of reason itself. We're suspicious about this axiom, and we think that this is not just a matter of a critique of philosophy or philosophical traditions, but we think this type of assumption about human nature is very much present in our thinking in our time as well, even if the name is not provoked as much as it was provoked in the past centuries. For instance, you can think about something as concrete, as real as economic relations that we are taking for granted in capitalistic societies, for instance. Every entry-level economics book will tell you something about human nature, even if they don't admit it. But there seems to be some form of assumption that here is what humanity is all about, and therefore this is the economic system. Now, if what they are claiming is actually something like human nature, then that makes sense. But if it is not, then it seems like that we are kind of tied up with a narrative about who we are at our core that may be actually a matter of historical contingency. That prompted us to talk about the concept of human nature, and what made it interesting for us to look into philosophy of biology or transdisciplinary studies that include philosophy and biology was the idea of change. That it seems like that one important feature of the last few centuries, like post Hegel and with Darwin, and then all the developments in the biological sciences in the 20th and 21st century, is that the idea of a core, the idea of a predetermined nature of a species seems to be in trouble. There are many ways that transformation and fundamental change has been put at the center of how evolution functions. And that was one of the main reasons why we got to evolutionary psychology, which actually stays at a very weird, strange, and interesting kind of intersection. On the one hand, it embraces all these points about the transformative power of evolution, the primacy of the scientific methodology, and all the dogmas and basic assumptions of biology and chemistry as we understand them in the 20th and 21st century. But at the same time, it argues for human nature. And that was something interesting for us, and we have spent some time going through the founding text of evolutionary psychology, and you can see that in our channel in the past episodes. What we are planning to do is to expand on that conversation and add to very kind of not so developed criticism that we provided at the end of that inquiry. And we're going to use a specific book that we're going to introduce in a second to help us articulate our thoughts and articulate our position, and ultimately, again, show us how this discussion gets related to very basic conflicts and questions that have started the Versucher project at its core. For instance, the universal individual distinction and the tension between the concepts that has been at the center of our attention. We're going to return to that concern after engaging with a robust criticism of evolutionary psychology. Trent, do you have anything to add?
Yes, that's a very detailed and multifaceted summary of what we have attempted for the past 2 years. If I may just try to recapitulate a couple of the themes, which I think are the questions or dynamics that we are interested in, even though we have different ways to articulate them. First is this Versucher project is not a predetermined paradigm following investigation. Instead, it's like an open-ended journey of exploration. And one of our primary objectives is to look at how different fields or disciplines that overlap, not in terms of concrete methods or the specific case they examine, but rather the way they integrate different ways to produce knowledge. Hence, like Hegel's trying to produce like logic, laying the foundation of all different epistemological systems. Evolutionary psychology, as we discussed in the previous episodes, is trying to find a way to integrate, at least, which was very explicit in its criticism of social science and humanities, which are, in their eyes, contented with their self-sufficiency or isolatedness. They feel, as a cultural anthropologist, that we do not have we don't need to pay attention to what evolutionary psychologists or biologists say about the human or animal behaviors. And so evolutionary psychology, that specific discipline or field, was invented somehow to break such rigid boundaries across the disciplines. And so such an ambition to integrate knowledge, different means of producing knowledge across fields, fits our long-term objective very well. So that's one thing. Second thing is, as you mentioned, universal individual relationship. You see that in cultural studies, you see that in history, you see that in philosophy, you see also, as we say here, the question of species and individual organisms which constitute individual species. So human nature, we agreed, Ron and I, after our discussion, is like elastic and how to say, accommodating enough for us to explore all these different types of universal individual dynamics. And one final thing is perhaps the name nature in it, for cultural anthropologists or historians, immediately evokes the like debate about culture nature divide or relationship in our interpretation of cultural phenomena. So there are many ways I think this specific theme, human nature, could engage curious listeners or readers who have their own specific questions, but I think these things are general enough to pull up interest together and hopefully give rise to provoking and productive conversations. So that's why we focus on the theme of human nature in this kind of second season of our episode series. Yes.
Excellent. To make this make our articulation of our problems with evolutionary psychology and kind of opening doors for both embracing some aspects of it and also overcoming its flaws, we're going to engage with a book called Adapting Mind, and this book is written by David J. Buehler. And David Buehler is alive, from what I know, and he is chair emeritus of the Department of Philosophy at Northern Illinois University. A fun and random fact is that we don't have any photos of him anywhere on the internet. So I don't know if this is a pseudonym, if it's just a ghost. I don't know what is happening. But if you know David J. Buehler and you have a photo of him, more importantly, please leave a comment and we will take it from there. So what we're going to do in this episode and the next episode is actually a critical summary of evolutionary psychology. But by critical, I don't mean criticism, but like critical points that are raised and how the basic answers that evolutionary psychology has to such objections and such problems. And then when we embark our intellectual journey accompanying David Buehler and expand on every major point that he makes in Adapting Mind. So if you don't have anything to add, we can just get it started on.
No, I don't have anything. I'll just proceed.
Okay, great. In fact, I think the next slide is kind of the beginning of really understanding what Buehler is embracing and what Buehler is attacking, and that difference is going to matter in how you should approach our summary in this episode, next episode, and that difference, that what is going to make that difference is the difference between capital evolutionary psychology and lowercase evolutionary psychology. So Trent, why don't you tell us a little bit about that distinction?
Yes, this book, Adapting Minds by David Buehler, has numerous layers of analysis and criticism of a few eminent figures that we're going to introduce in a second. But if we were able to condense all the multi-layers of the argument into one line, he tries to provide a new way to think about how evolution and the psychology or human mind, human brain interact, our these two approaches interact without subscribing to a paradigm established by several eminent figures in the field, namely, I will introduce that in the next slide, so I just won't give the name. So that's why he emphasized the distinction between the capital letter evolutionary psychology versus the small one. So the minuscule or lowercase letter evolutionary psychology. For the capital one, he uses this phrase to refer to a paradigm. For the lowercase one, he uses it to refer to a field. And I will explain briefly what he means by these two terms. So paradigm, for a lot of listeners of ours, they would definitely appreciate that this is like reference to Thomas Kuhn's famous book, where he lays out the institutional as well as systematic practice behind the normal science, namely is the paradigm construction and paradigm shift. So within each paradigm, you have a specific set of research objectives and very clearly defined methodology to construct the data or empirical evidence to mostly to affirm or to clarify, to contextualize such tenets. Only when so many anomalies have been generalized that you move on to a new one. And the target of criticism for David Buller in this book is precisely the paradigm in the making. And we will talk about its tenets and premises in this and the following episode. But he does that like what Martin Luther did during the Reformation against the Catholic Church, is not to get rid of or to dispense with Christianity or like certain important rituals like baptism itself, but rather to get rid of the wrong way of doing God. Basically, for David Buller, it's like they were, after those people he criticized, were asking really important questions, and those questions, instead of the method they come up with, should become the defining feature of quote unquote the field of evolutionary psychology, because a field, according to Buller, is defined by the importance scholars to given to a specific set of questions instead of the specific method devised to answer those questions. So it's like Martin Luther criticizing church to preserve the true religion or return to the early church. And for David Buller is trying to dismantle the emerging paradigm of capital letter EP evolutionary psychology, so as we could really see lowercase ep evolutionary psychology as a field in its true like diversity or plasticity, or the lack of consensus in terms of specific methods or tenets. So that's my summary of that central thesis or objective of this project.
Yes, and I think this is excellent, because it's just kind of like makes it like important that what Buller is doing is not, and whether we agree with that or not, that's a different question, is not to dismantle the use of evolutionary biology to understand human psychology, right?
Yes.
What he tries to dismantle or rebuke is the way that a specific group of people that are both in the academia, but also they're very kind of writing like popular, science books, have been kind of become the faces of evolutionary psychology, of how evolution gets connected with human psychology, right? And there are certain figures that are important in this paradigm of capital E, capital P evolution psychology. So Trent, why don't you tell us a little bit about these fellows?
Yes, on this slide you will see 3 photos, and they cover the 4 figures that we engaged quite in considerable length in the previous episode when we were reviewing that book, Adapted Mind. So on the left, upper left corner is David Buss, who is the professor at UT, my alma mater at this point. And lower left, you see the couple of Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, who are the chief editor or the mastermind of the Adapted Mind we discussed already. And the guy on the right is Steven Pinker, who wrote prolifically on evolutionary psychology, EP, and these four are the chief interlocutors, we can say, for David Buller. To a certain extent, David Buller is very appreciative of their contributions, but he wants to point out the implicit assumptions that they all shared and try to alert future researchers in this field not to subscribe to their tenets without a questioning. So with that said, I think we can just move on to next slide to see what kind of central tenets these 4 or 5 figures really hold, and how do that, what kind of research that kind of paradigm would obligate us to enter into this investigation.
Yes. And that basic idea we have tried to condense in one paragraph. So I'm going to read it as you see it, and then we're going to kind of unpack it. This is, again, according to evolutionary psychologists, exemplified by these 4 figures, not limited to them, but according to Buller, as the figure that represent this trend in evolutionary psychology better than anyone else. The human mind consists of a set of specialized psychological mechanisms that were evolved through natural selection as a response to adaptive problems our ancestors faced in the Pleistocene period. These psychological mechanisms are not artifacts of culture shaped by Pleistocene environments, nor are they transmitted through a learning process. As a result, they constitute what we can call human nature. Now, in unpacking this, we have decided to kind of categorizing it based on like a specific terms that you see here and go after one after another, so that we can kind of get a better grasp of what these terms mean. Like when we talk about adaptation, what we're talking about. When we talk about Pleistocene period, what are we talking about? When we're talking about learning, what we're talking about. Environment, what we're talking about. So, and this is how we're going to talk about this, how like the order of our conversation is going to be, as you see on the screen at the moment. So we're going to start with evolution. Before doing that, Sharon, do you have anything to add to this basic tenet of evolution psychology?
No, it reminds me of how famous definitions of religion are construed over the past several decades. They're always like 5 to 10 lines long, and you have to dissect them to criticize or dismantle it, like axiom, basically. Okay, let's just.
And one might wonder if that might not be a problem that contaminates any definition, like maybe definition as a strategy, as some sort of a fundamental flaw. But in any case, so the first term that we want to talk about in this kind of manifesto, the concise manifesto of evolutionary psychology, is evolution, right? So it's very important that the psychological mechanisms that evolutionary psychologists are very interested in, they're evolved through natural selection. Now, there are 2 things within this like little phrase, evolution and natural selection, and both of them are important, right? So evolution, as it understood in a post-Darwinian era, because Darwin did not have access to genetics, is about change in gene or genotypes frequencies at a particular locus across generations in a lineage. And lineage is a temporal sequence of populations, a group of reproductively interacting organisms. Now, of course, we need to kind of be mindful of, like, there are, again, this is it could be an infinite regress of like what each of these terms mean, or what they're kind of like excluding, because we need to be kind of be mindful that when we say reproductively interacting organisms, like bacteria are part of these process of evolution, but like their function of reproduction might not be about so much about interaction. It could be a different type of activity, like splitting. But in any case, what is important in like insofar as our conversation is going to go, is that evolution is about this gene change, and gene change not just in a single individual organism, but in a population. That's what we are interested in. Now, if like the beak of one bird among like 1 million birds change, that is not necessarily, I mean, that's an evolved feature, but it's not, it's not going to show itself up unless many other things happen in the population. And what we care for is that population level analysis. Selection is the cumulative retention of fitness enhancing genetic traits in response to adaptive problems faced on by biological entities. So we will talk about like what these adaptive problems are all about, but it is important to understand what this is covering and what this is not covering, because cumulative retention of fitness enhancing genetic traits, right? So this is not about, selection is not about cumulative retention of any genetic trait. And that is going to be important later on in our discussions. The fitness enhancing part is basically referring to chances for reproduction, like kind of lasting chances for reproduction. And it could include very kind of like raw, visible, anatomical things, right? Or it could be about like neurological changes, like emergence of brain, according to many, is a result of a cumulative retention of fitness enhancing genetic traits that ultimately led us to something like unified nervous system and a brain. Now, why is that important? Because evolution is not just about natural selection, right? For instance, in small populations, there could be genetic drift that in the language of genetics could go to fixation, right? So like because like genetic is not by any means a perfect process. And of course, when we say that it's not a perfect process, that doesn't mean that it's absolutely random either, right? We just mean that like drifts from a quote unquote program could happen. And if that happens, that could have an effect of what ends up surviving in an environment. And especially if the population is small, that genetic drift could get to a point of fixation, which means that it is now the feature of that population, right? Now, something else could also make sense of stable genetic changes. Because note that we want to think about, when we think about evolution, as stable genetic changes. That's not the only thing that we are thinking about, but that's at the center of what we're thinking about. But like, you can think about a population of, let's say, lions, and let's say that these lions, that they have certain alpha males, and whatever the characteristic of those alpha males are, that has been part of natural selection, let's say, right? But for a random reason that is not related to any sort of predictable feature of the environment, there was a flood. And it happens to be the case that the most fertile lands in that landscape are the ones that are going to be washed away by the flood. Now, this will disrupt, by killing the alpha males in that landscape, this will disrupt the genetic structure of a group of lions, a population of lions that might, start having start a cascade of consequences for the generations of lions as a species. It might return to some of those stable features that the alpha males had. It might start a new type of genetic variation based on the new environment and the new dynamic between lions, a new landscape that has emerged, right? This doesn't mean that there was some form of a modification and slow accumulation and retention of fitness enhancing genetic traits. The lions that survived didn't survive because they were the smarter ones or they were the more powerful ones. They just survived because of a whole range of other reasons. Evolution is not reducible to natural selection. For evolutionary psychologists, though, what matters is evolved traits through natural selection. And we're going to see more details about that in a moment. But before doing that, Trin.
Yes, I think this slide really highlights the similarity between evolutionary psychology and the specific strand of historical science, especially social scientific theory, informed historical science. So first bullet point on the slide, evolution. This is a matter of time or temporality. So history, evolution, both science of change. What constitute identity, what remains the same despite its constant adaptation and change. Second is the selection, and that's perhaps reason in history or reason across times. What is the specific theory a historian uses to account for most, but not all, the changes in society? Say Marxist theory of historical progress, focused on relationship production, means of production, stuff like that. We can radically reduce the complex social realities to specific archetypes, and we move from feudalism to capitalistic society. Yet, like Marxist historian or a evolutionary psychologist, the capital letter as a paradigm subscriber, their theory or their model is not designed to account for all changes or variations in history or evolution of a species. Instead, there's space reserved for so-called contingency. And here's precisely what people like Tooby and the Cosmides would say. Of course, certain random events happened in the history of, in the natural history, and not everything ever happened as a part of natural selection in the way we compute our model. But what really matters for the question of the evolution of human mind is precisely those traits, especially fitness enhancing traits. So it's a functional analysis, fitness enhancing traits accumulated across time, which kind of dictate or color our current social individual behaviors. So I think by juxtaposing historical science in a very broad sense with evolutionary psychology, we can see a lot of parallels and similarities in their understanding on the relationship between the main mover or shaper of history and the contingency in history. Yes.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think it's an excellent point that we're going to revisit the parallel between evolution and history and how this kind of the idea of the kind of the reason and history part, find some form of a parallel. By no means the exact same thing in evolutionary theory. And yeah, and I am also interested how, understanding the evolutionary process could actually inform us about those categories in the historical analysis and vice versa, if that's a possibility of kind of both of these sides to have a conversation. I think the same thing goes to the categories of necessity and contingency. And I think especially a more careful understanding of evolutionary process, I think is going to be very informative in understanding that relationship, a relationship that might be understood in a very kind of vague and dull way in philosophical or historical analysis in general. Very good. The other thing about this whole thing about evolution that is important is that, we can talk about the genotype and the phenotype. And the thing is that, genes are responsible for the creation of certain, like, observable features of an entity, right? And evolution happens at the level of the genes. But that doesn't mean that genes are this kind of like magical thing that they're just kind of like you put them anywhere, and just like suddenly you have a thing, right? It's not that like the genes are anything without an environment. And this concept of environment is going to become very pivotal in our conversations. But what we like, Bueller mentions a number of examples, but like the example of the corn seed, I think, is very telling. That like if you have the exact same corn seed with the same genotype, and you put it in different soil condition and fertilize and water those plants differently, you won't get the same phenotype, which is the corn plate that is gonna emerge, right? Any kind of feature of that plant, height, sweetness, whatever, is just going to be different. Okay, so just because something is genetic, that doesn't tell you what exactly what exact phenotypes to expect. Even when that relationship is very quote unquote simple, like a corn seed, let alone a complex organism with like many different genes in very kind of versatile environments, right? So although we talk about like evolution at the level of genotype, we need to understand like that doesn't mean that has a specific meaning, right? That doesn't mean that with understanding that we have mastered the art of understanding what phenotypes are going to pop up. Now, something is very important, which is that there is probably no soil that you can put the corn seed and a dinosaur will come out of it, right? So there's a limitation of like what could come from one gene, but the relation between gene and phenotype is not determined. It's not predetermined. It might be predetermined in a way that you can say that this gene could have this graph of expression. That could be determined, at least for a simpler stories when it comes to genes. But it's not that like you have the gene, you have the phenotype, right? So that's also important. Now, the other thing that is important in general to understand is that like it doesn't matter like how much you do bodybuilding in your life, right? Your babies are not gonna born with like stronger muscles. No different than if you just like sat on the couch for like 15 hours a day. The idea there is that like change, again, when we're thinking about change, could have different sources. Now, like think about it in a different way. Let's say that I do bodybuilding, and like we kind of craft a religion that says anyone who doesn't do bodybuilding is a sinner and is just gonna burn in hell. And like because of that, everyone is supposed to do bodybuilding, right? And perhaps none of that kind of bodybuilding as like practice is going to transfer to any sort of genetic change, but there is some sort of a phenotypic evolution that is just its own story. So here is still a question of, when we speak of change, how much of that change is about evolution as understood in natural sciences, right? And how much of that could be about like phenotypic evolution? Because there could be an argument that whatever phenotypic evolution is possible, it is itself determined by the possibilities that a configuration of genotypes can offer, right? Like the fact that you can choose to do bodybuilding is itself determined genetically for millions of other reasons. And in fact, perhaps some aspects of it is going to be determined by like psychological mechanisms, evolutionary psychologists would say, that would make bodybuilding more attractive than just, a very dominant like cult of suicide or some other kind of self-destructive or collective self-destruction of humanity. I'm not saying this as an endorsement. I'm just saying that like there is the question of change. What constitutes change? In what space that change happens, and how this gets related to genotypic change and evolution is something that we still don't have an answer to in this conversation. This is something that is going to pop up as we talk about details of Builder's analysis. Trent?
Yes. Just to very quickly summarize what you said. I think one way to look at this is for subscribers of this paradigm for evolutionary psychology, capital letter EP, there's the change happens in the temple, but the temple has the two spaces. One is the inner sanctum, the other is the precinct, the stuff around the temple. And like stuff we observe in, say, humanities or a lot of interpretive social sciences like sociology oftentimes belong to the phenotypic realm or the outer space. So that space is, of course, change. We can document their changes, but they are not the reason that guides change in history. What you really want to, if you really want to know the reason or the like real agent or actors of history or change, you need to go to the inner sanctum where like genotypes locate. And its change does not just regulate, it's not just, it's a change, its structure, genes does not just preserve the changes accumulated across time towards genes, but it also influences ways, phenotypes or behaviors or faculties that are conditions of a specific species across time. So there is a very strict hierarchical relationship between genotype and phenotype in their kind of interpretation of the causality across time. Yes. With that said, we can.
I think there's something important there, because I think the point that you're mentioning is actually very important in like bringing forward another kind of layer of hierarchy, because I think one hierarchy is the hierarchy of what is necessary, what is contingent, right? So necessity and contingency are important features. But then there is also this whole point about that if there is a change, right, what is the, kind of hierarchical power there? Like what institutes the real change, right? What it constitutes like just kind of real transformation, right? And what is just like kind of like like the superstructure kind of a thing, right? Like that is just like what is happening at the level of a superficial thing. Yes, like a classic Marxist might say that you see like a capitalistic society like going through different quote unquote fashions, right? Maybe there are now kind of like really just in the way that they in social life like they appear is very different from like early 20th century, but the structure is the same. The real transformation hasn't happened. The real transformation was the transformation from like feudalism to capitalism, and we're still there, right? And I think that is going to work really well with the categorization that evolutionary psychologists are very interested in, and that is important in understanding of how they think of stability as a stability that came through a specific type of a change and kind of solidified at a certain point as the real thing, and all of these other kind of phenotypic evolution as something that is just like on the surface. Now, we mentioned the point about adaptation. Trent, why don't you tell us a little bit about like that point, because adaptation is essential in understanding the concept of natural selection.
Yes, I think it's a good way to transit from what we just discussed to this second, the first feature, important element of that definition, evolution, to the second, this more concrete form. How are we going to approach and like analyze evolution? For people like Tooby, they will say we should focus on adaptive problems, identify, characterize them, and really describe their historical significance. How did such adaptive problems or questions shape or guide the evolution of a species? And we have, after our discussion, we put up 3 concrete points to characterize this specific concept. First, it's a historical. Adaptation is historical. And by that, there's something very interesting here, because historical could mean 2 things. And that would be a major point of departure between Buller and his the persons that he's criticizing. For people like Tooby, historical means the maker of history, maker of human nature as we have now, happened in the past, in the sense that they are no longer with us. So, of course, Aran, you would mention the important period. In a second, is just when we are trying to understand the current human instincts and behaviors, so we should not just look at the contemporary environment or setting or even adaptive problem. We should look at our ancestral environment and their adaptive problems. So it's historical in that sense. Of course, Buller would challenge. As I mentioned before, Buller is trying to criticize the paradigm of evolutionary psychology to kind of reaffirm the utility of that field. And Buller would not disagree that evolutionary psychology is a historical sense, but he would probably define historical in a different way, in the sense it's not something happened in the past, and the evidence or the specific environment we try to describe has no direct connection with our current environment, but in the sense of a historical interaction, or more specifically in history, we will call it a reception study. So like how the past influence and then shapes the present, and how the present is kind of reaction to the past. So it's like past and present dialogue, more in that mode for Buller, but not for his the people he criticized. For them, the influence unilateral, like the past happened certain thing, and we still carry that with us. So that's first point about historical. Second is adaptation is a specific way to unpack how human mind as we have now is a result, or is it in dialogue or in an interaction with natural selection or evolution. And the hallmark here is functional analysis. There's a causality and how to identify the cause is that we analyze the specific adaptive problems. What are the pressures specific population or species faced in a specific environment, and what are the coping mechanisms or they devised, or not they devised, but they came to possess, which would enhance their survival and reproduction. So functional analysis, adapted mind could be reconstructed functionally because its faculties, the mechanisms help us to cope with such adaptive problems. That's the reason of existence for such mechanism. That's why they became popular and like successful in via a long time of natural selection. And the third and final point is the specific unit of analysis will be adaptive problems. I think it's kind of a synthesis of the previous 2 points, as instead of talking about evolution as a general term, we should compartmentalize it into specific cells, and within it, each will identify a specific problem and a specific mechanism the mind developed to cope with such a problem. Hence, mind should be understood or analyzed not as a general whole, but as a accumulation of like various myriads. The specific number they propose is thousands of like mechanisms, which are concrete, kind of self-sufficient, as at least use unit of analysis for research purposes. And by such way of compartmentalizing, we could do empirical analysis and correlate the problems with our specific mental mechanisms, and we can improve our understanding of what human beings are by adding to the list of identified and explained mechanisms and their historical root, namely the adaptive problems. Finally, to emphasize, those problems are not the ones that we are dealing at a daily basis now at times, but in a previous period, which was the critical or the formative period of human evolution. So with these summaries, I think they are providing a very concrete questionnaire or a research guide for people who want to use evolutionary biology to explain how do human beings come to be like this, and what does it mean to be human in our time? Yes.
Yes. One just tiny point to add is that notice that when we think about these adaptive problems, like selective pressure, you can call it, we're talking about like certain fitness enhancing kind of reactions that some genetic distribution or some genetic configuration or some specific gene has survived merely because, not because someone decided for it to survive, just because it survived. It survived, though, if it's like selected because it was able to kind of solve a problem in that environment. And then it just kind of be there with that biological entity. What I want to focus on, though, is that like notice for now just how this might be different when we look at two different categories. One category could be the category of, let's say the development of human lungs, right? And some aspects of that could be, about like selection pressure, about like, filtering contaminated air, right? Like if we had like a competing group of populations, human populations, and one was terrible at like dealing with like random changes in, level of pollution, then that lung did not survive because there was a selective pressure on like the lungs that could filter the right amount of air, that could like give that a specific human population a reproductive advantage, right? And we just happen to be descendants of those. Now, you can think about this also as like kind of like psychological problems, right? That are just not about like as kind of chemical and like direct and immediate as like air and metabolism. Could be about finding a mate, right? And that's going to be important about like how we can, when we start to try to identify adaptive problems, whether we're in the same position of talking about evolution of lungs and evolution of like sexual behavior, right? Whether these two things have the same type of a structure. And we're going to talk about this later on. Okay, good. Very important is the point that what evolutionary psychologists are interested in is that we've got a certain psychological mechanisms that are the result of selection by evolutionary selection because of their fitness enhancing properties at a certain time in our history. Okay, now what is it? What is the importance of psychological mechanisms? The importance is that we're not talking about behavior. We're talking about mechanism. And this is the point that Buehler mentions some major critiques of evolutionary psychology have not appreciated at all, right? So evolutionary psychology is not saying that the outputs are fixed. It is saying that the proximate mechanism that generate outputs, meaning behaviors, are fixed, right? So the claim is not uniformity in behavior, but uniformity in mechanisms behind the behavior, right? Evolutionary psychologists do not deny variation in behavior. They deny that variation in behavior means variation in mechanism, right? To kind of invoke something that we have already talked about, the corn seed. Okay, so the corn seed could be put in a fertile land, could be watered well, or could be put in like the desert, right? Or we can just like use a specific type of like chemical to add to the soil. We might decide on a like kind of organic development of it. And at the end of the day, what we're going to get is going to be a different output as like the phenotypic structure of that, the developed version of that corn seed, right? But the thing is, again, that genotype wasn't something that could have produced like a pineapple tree, right? It doesn't matter how much fertilizer you add to that soil. This gene is not there to give you like a banana tree. Like that's not what you are getting, right? And that's important because I think there is a parallel in the way that evolutionary psychologists understand the relationship between mechanism and behavior. They think the mechanism is determined because the mechanism is an adaptation, and the mechanism is an adaptation as a matter of selection. But that is like to say that the seed, the genetic structure of the corn seed is a selection. It can turn out in different ways, but that turnout in different ways itself is very limited, right? And we are going to discuss like how this is going to show up in evolutionary psychology's understanding of variation. But the basic idea is that for evolutionary psychologists, variation is not a problem. Variation of behavior. What might be a problem for them is that there are variations in mechanisms. Okay, so if, for instance, we say that some aspects of our mate choice are psychological mechanisms, there are psychological mechanisms behind our behavior that lead to our choices for mating, what we are saying is not to say that in every single culture and for every single individual, we're going to get the exact same behavior. Everyone just goes for this type of a mate, and everyone has the exact same kind of like a structure in the relationship that is established with that person. What we're saying is that their variation is actually should be understood as different manifestations of the same mechanism, right? For instance, evolution psychologists want to say that female human beings are inclined to be sensitive to status, and if possible, they will pick a high status man over a lower status man. That means they need to be able to identify status. Now, maybe in a specific society, sewing is like a great sign of status. So whoever is a better sewer, like, is the one that is on top of that structure. Maybe another society, being a banker is to be on top of like that kind of high status. That doesn't matter. It might require a whole bunch of other activities to get to the man that sews, than getting to the man that is a banker. But that mechanism that draws women in human populations to status is something that is fixed, right? And Buehler agrees with evolutionary psychologists that this is, unlike something like young Earth creationism, a testable claim that we can verify through experimentation, right? Young Earth creationism is not a testable claim, verifiable by experimentation, because even if we find a stone that is looks like 1 billion years old, someone could say that, hey, that God made this like 10,000 years ago, as if it looks like it is like 1 billion years ago, was made 1 billion years ago, right? And whatever like data is added, the data just vanishes into the theory. And because of that, it's not going to be verifiable. But Buehler thinks that there are meaningful ways to show that evolutionary psychologists are wrong. And we're going to talk about those approaches shortly. Trent, anything about this one?
Not really. I think you did a good job summarizing. One thing, if I may connect, is what you said here with what we said about Adapted Mind, that book collected by Tooby and Cosmides. One important distinction that couple drew is the relationship between metaculture and evoked cultures. And I think that's what sits in very well with what Buehler emphasized in defense of evolutionary psychology, that paradigm against a misguided criticism from Stephen Jay Gould, in the sense that what evolution psychology aspires to uncover and describe is that metaculture across what we call cultural differences among human beings. For instance, you mentioned that status-seeking tendency, and we can also talk about like incest taboo. Like different societies use different kinship structures to regulate the exchange of male or female, but that tendency to avoid intermarry within the same nucleus family or it's kind of observable across culture, even though the way they deal with it is very different. Some use a patrilineal, some ask people to like marry their daughters to faraway villages, not to their direct neighbors. So they use different mechanisms, but they go about the ultimate function or the purpose, pan-human, cross-cultural purpose, according to evolutionary psychologists, remain the same, namely to avoid incest. And
Yes.
with that, I think we should just proceed. Yes.
Yes, and we're going to talk about all of these points about culture very, very soon in details. So let's just cover the last point that we want to talk about in this one, and that's the fact that evolutionary psychologists emphasize that these psychological mechanisms are specialized. That means that what they're claiming is not that the general psychological tendency of human beings can be thought as a mechanism, and the mechanism is an adaptation, and that adaptation has shown itself in our evolutionary past. That's not what they mean. They want to say something that we can call the multi-modularity thesis, meaning that we are not just born by just like a tendency. We're not just born by just some vague like ability to categorize. We have specialized mechanisms, right? Here's why we have specialized mechanisms. Because without any head start, domain general learning would face the insoluble problem of learning, right? We can never know which aspects of the world are more important than the others, right? On entering the world, Bueller mentions, should the baby pay more attention to the walls of the nursery or to mother's face, right? That is a very specific, like, a very specific attention clue needs to be there for helping the baby make that distinction. And without that, we're just going to be this kind of like a vague entity within like a very kind of noisy environment. Also, we have lots of adaptive problems, finding a mate, avoiding danger, and we need to be sensitive to different layers of environment. A domain general apparatus, according to evolutionary psychology, cannot really give us this specific sensitivity. So it seems like that for evolutionary psychologists, we kind of like tap into these different modules as we see fit at that specific moment. And they might get developed at different times. Maybe a baby doesn't, the module for, sexual attention is not there yet, and it might get developed later on. But because it's developed later on doesn't mean that it was a matter of cultural learning. It was just like a teeth. Like babies don't have teeth. That doesn't mean teeth is a cultural construction. Babies do not have ready to show sexual strategy, but the development of that is about this module getting activated, not something new learned from the world. And one like kind of continuous point of attention is language, right? That we are going to be incapable of learning a language unless we have mechanisms to reduce the possibilities in an environment, reduce the noise to be able to acquire anything we need from that environment. Without that, something like language is not possible. Trey?
Yes, just one quick note to connect all the 4 points we so far discussed is to understand how evolution and the human mind interacted in history. According to the evolutionary psychologist, we need to bear in mind two things, seemingly contradictory, but they are actually in reality mutually complementary. One is we're studying something very concrete, so very specific adaptive problems, very specific psychological mechanisms which are specialized to cope with such problems on one hand. On the other hand, general or universal. Such mechanisms are available to all human beings, regardless of their environmental or like cultural structure or institution, whatever. So those are the bold claims made so far. We've only dealt with half of that definition, and but yeah, those that's a very interesting, dynamic, universal, and it's concrete. And I think it'll be very interesting to see the other half of the definition in the coming episode. Yes.
Yes. So stay tuned, everyone. We will continue the critical summary of evolutionary psychology in the next episode.
Bye for now. Stay tuned.